used to believe that every system, no matter how complicated, came down to one honest question. What happens when you remove the load-bearing piece without telling anyone? Most people never find out. They build their whole careers on top of someone else's architecture and never once check what's actually holding the weight. I found out, and I'm the one who decided exactly when everyone else would find out too. My name is Arthur Vance. For 6 years, I was the quiet guy on the 11th floor of Halbrook Meridian Capital, a mid-size fintech firm that moved client money through trading algorithms. Most of the executives upstairs couldn't have explained if their bonuses depended on it. Which, in a way, they did. I wore soft gray sweaters, wire-rimmed glasses. I kept my head down, drank bad coffee, and built systems that made other people look brilliant in meetings I wasn't invited to. I didn't mind that mostly. I've always thought of human organizations the way I think of data architecture, full of redundancies, failure points, and people who mistake uptime for understanding. I just didn't expect to become a case study in my own theory. I want to tell you a little about how I see the world, because it matters for everything that happens after. I don't think in terms of good people and bad people. I think in terms of systems that are honestly labeled and systems that are lying about their own architecture. A company is just a machine made of human decisions, and like any machine, it has a maintenance schedule nobody wants to pay for and a load-bearing wall nobody wants to credit. I'd spent 6 years being that wall, quietly, competently, without a single complaint. Because complaints, in my experience, just tell people exactly where to apply pressure if they ever decide to push you out. This is the story of how I got erased from a company, and how I came back wearing a different face to watch it erase itself. Here's the thing about a trading firm's infrastructure that nobody outside the server room ever appreciates. A company's entire balance sheet sits on top of invisible load-bearing walls. Thousands of lines of clean, quiet automation code, running in the dark, executing thousands of micro-decisions a second, while the people in the corner offices take credit for vision and leadership. I built one of those walls. I called it Pellucid, a margin optimization engine that recalculated cross-market exposure in real time and shaved error rates so far down that it lifted the firm's overall efficiency by 40% in a single fiscal quarter. 40%. In this industry, that's not an improvement. That's a different company. I brought the finished build to my direct manager, a man named Julian Reyes, 2 weeks before the quarterly board review. Julian had the kind of face that looked permanently mid-handshake. He didn't write code. He didn't read code. What Julian did with real and frightening mastery was manage upward, feeding executives exactly the words they wanted to hear and exactly the cadence that made them feel smart for hiring him. I remember the exact moment I handed it over. We were in a glass-walled conference room that smelled like dry erase marker, and I'd printed out a 1-page summary because Julian had a habit of nodding at slides instead of reading them. I walked him through the architecture, the recursive margin checks, the redundancy layer, the way Pellucid could absorb a market shock that would have crippled our old system in under 4 seconds. He didn't ask a single technical question, not one. He asked what it would sound like in a board deck. "This is incredible, Arthur," he told me, scrolling through my documentation without reading a line of it. "We'll present this together. Equal billing. I mean it." I want you to sit with that phrase for a second. I mean it. I've found that people who need to say that out loud usually don't. I should have known right then, honestly. I'd worked with Julian long enough to recognize the particular silence that fell over him whenever he was deciding how to spend something that wasn't his. He got very calm, very agreeable. The version of Julian that agreed with everything you said was the version of Julian already planning what to do once you weren't in the room anymore. 3 days later, Julian stood in front of the executive board alone. He'd altered the repository access logs, a clumsy edit, frankly, the kind of thing that wouldn't survive 5 minutes of real forensic scrutiny, but nobody in that boardroom knew how to check, and that was the whole point. Competence is invisible to people who don't have any. He claimed sole authorship of Pellucid. He used words like led, architected, and spearheaded, roughly 400 times in a 19-minute presentation I wasn't even invited to watch. I heard about it secondhand, from a junior analyst who came by my desk afterward looking a little sick, like she'd watched something get stolen in broad daylight and didn't know who to tell. By Friday, Julian had a new title, Senior Vice President of Strategic Operations. I didn't fight it, not because I was weak, and not because I didn't understand exactly what had happened to me. I understood it better than anyone in that building, because I'm the one who built the thing he stole. I stayed quiet because I was already 3 moves ahead and screaming tips your hand. There's a particular kind of clarity that comes over you in that moment, the moment you realize the system has already decided who wins, and that fighting inside that system just confirms its rules instead of breaking them. I didn't want to win an argument with Julian. I wanted to win the next 9 months. Julian, it turned out, wasn't finished. A man who steals your work once will always wonder if you're going to ask for it back. So to make absolutely sure I never could, he did something almost elegant in its cruelty. He fabricated a compliance report. Unauthorized data extraction. Attempted IP theft. He filed it through HR with just enough technical-sounding language to make it stick, phrases like unauthorized lateral access and suspicious export activity. Nothing a forensic auditor couldn't have dismantled in an afternoon, but nothing HR was ever going to bring in a forensic auditor to check, either. By the following Monday, security was waiting at my desk with a cardboard box already folded and waiting on the chair, like they'd known exactly how this morning was going to go before I'd even poured my coffee. I looked at the termination papers. I looked at the false accusation with my name typed neatly under subject. And I looked briefly at Julian, who was watching from the doorway of his new corner office like a man checking that a vending machine had actually dispensed the soda he paid for. He didn't even have the decency to look uncomfortable. He looked satisfied, the way you look when a problem you'd been worrying about quietly resolves itself. The security guard who walked me to the elevator was a guy named Desmond who'd worked the front desk for as long as I'd worked there. He didn't say anything the whole ride down, but right as the doors opened to the lobby, he muttered, "For what it's worth, man, I don't believe a word of that report." I told him I appreciated it. I meant it more than he probably realized. I didn't yell. I didn't threaten a lawsuit, though I had grounds for one, and believe me, I thought about it. Sitting in my car in the parking garage with the box on the passenger seat, running the math on what a wrongful termination suit would actually accomplish. Money, eventually, maybe. A settlement with a non-disclosure clause attached to it like a leash. A year or 2 of lawyers picking through my old emails while Julian kept climbing, completely unbothered, because companies protect their executives the way immune systems protect tumors they've already decided not to notice. A lawsuit would have made me feel righteous for about a month and accomplished nothing structural. I didn't want to feel righteous. I wanted Julian's whole foundation to fail, on a timeline of my choosing, in front of an audience he couldn't buy his way out of. I packed my single box, a desk plant, a mechanical keyboard, 6 years of muscle memory, and I said one word. Understood. He smiled at that. He thought it meant I was beaten. It meant I'd already started designing the thing that would end him. I want to pause here for a second because I know some of you watching this have lived a version of this story. Maybe not with code, maybe with a presentation, a sale, a recipe, a client list. Something you built quietly that somebody else put their name on in the daylight. So before I show you the flaw I left sleeping in their mainframe, do me a favor, hit like, subscribe, and drop your city and your profession in the comments. Because if you've ever watched a bad boss steal your credit and smile about it, You already know exactly what kind of storm was about to hit Julian's glass office. You just don't know how slow or how quiet it was going to be. Here's what I didn't do. I didn't steal data on the way out. I didn't delete a single file, corrupt a single database, or leave some dramatic message blinking on a server room monitor like a movie villain. That's not sabotage. That's vandalism, and vandalism gets you arrested. It also gets noticed immediately, which defeats the entire purpose. What I left behind was smaller and far more patient. Inside Pellucid's core calculation engine, buried in a margin adjustment subroutine that exactly nobody but me had ever needed to touch, I left a single piece of logical decay. A rounding function that was technically correct. It would pass any code review, any audit, any junior analyst's glance, but subtly, deliberately imprecise. It miscalculated international cross-market trade margins by a few hundredths of a percent. A few hundredths of a percent sounds like nothing. It is nothing for about a day. But errors in a compounding system don't stay still. They compound. I built the decay to recalibrate itself exponentially, gathering weight like a snowball rolling downhill, engineered to reach a fully destabilizing, headline-grade catastrophe at almost the exact 90-day mark. I'd chosen 90 days for a specific reason, and I'll tell you what it was, because I think it matters to the kind of person who's still watching this far in. 90 days is long enough that the people closest to the launch stop checking it daily. It's long enough that confidence replaces vigilance. Julian, specifically, was going to spend those 90 days believing Pellucid was his, internalizing it, taking credit for its smoothness in every all-hands meeting, building an entire identity on top of a foundation he had never once laid a single brick of. The longer he leaned on it, the harder the fall was going to feel, because the higher up you build your sense of self on something you didn't earn, the further you have to drop when it finally gives way underneath you. 90 days. Long enough that nobody would connect it to the analyst who got walked out by security in March. Long enough for Julian to get comfortable. Long enough for him to redecorate his new office, buy a better watch, and start referring to Pellucid as my system in meetings without a flicker of guilt. I spent those 90 days rebuilding myself instead of rebuilding code. I'd been the quiet guy in a sweater for 6 years. Quiet had got me robbed. So I worked with a stylist, a barber, and I won't lie to you, a fairly significant amount of coffee-fueled, sleepless personal reinvention. It started small. I cut out the soft gray sweaters first, almost as a kind of mourning, like shedding the skin of the person who had let this happen to him. Then came the frames, sharper, darker, nothing wire-rimmed or apologetic about them. I found a barber 2 towns over who didn't know me from anywhere and asked him to shape a beard I'd never bothered growing in 6 years of telling myself I didn't have the face for one. Turns out I did. I just hadn't needed it yet. The suits took longer, and they mattered more than anything else. I went to a tailor who measured me 3 separate times across 3 separate fittings, the kind of patience that costs real money but buys you something you can't get off a rack. A posture that isn't borrowed. I practiced walking into rooms differently, slower. I practiced not filling silences, because Julian, I remembered, always filled silences. It was the tell of a man who needed everyone to know he was in charge of a room he didn't actually understand. I trained myself out of that habit entirely. Say less. Let people lean toward you to catch what you're not saying. Confidence, it turns out, is something you can architect the same way you architect a system, if you understand the inputs, and I had spent 6 years studying exactly the kind of man I needed to become to walk back through that door unrecognized. By day 80-something, Halbrook Meridian's Q3 forecasts started bleeding numbers nobody could explain. Dashboards that were supposed to be green were flickering amber, then red. Risk metrics misfired. The kind of automated alerts that usually meant check your formatting were instead screaming, the foundation under this building is moving. And Julian, Senior Vice President of Strategic Operations, a man who had never once opened a terminal window in his professional life, had absolutely no idea why. I heard later that he spent 2 full days convinced it was a junior analyst's mistake and fired someone over it before anyone upstairs even understood the scope of what was actually happening. That detail, when it reached me, was the first time in months I let myself smile. Panic, I've learned, makes even careful people sloppy. Julian didn't go to engineering first. He went to the CEO because Julian's entire skill set was managing the people above him, not solving the problem below him. He pitched an emergency external audit, a crisis intervention so urgent it justified an eye-watering consulting fee, and he personally championed bringing in a boutique forensic firm called Apex Solutions Group. Apex Solutions Group did not exist 4 months earlier. I built it the way I built everything else, quietly, carefully, with all the right paperwork. A registered LLC, a minimalist website with exactly enough manufactured case studies to look credible and not one detail more. A phone number that rang straight to a burner I kept in my glove compartment, and a single, exceptionally well-credentialed lead consultant listed on the letterhead. Me. I'd built fake authorship documents before Julian had, after all, taught me that lesson personally, free of charge on company time. I walked back into the building I'd been escorted out of, in a suit that cost more than my old monthly salary, carrying a leather portfolio instead of a cardboard box. The same security guard who'd watched me leave in March held the door for me in June and called me sir. I remember standing in that lobby for 1 extra second longer than I needed to, just absorbing how different the air felt walking in instead of being walked out. Julian met me in the lobby. He shook my hand. His grip was damp, actual physical proof. If you ever needed it, that panic has a smell and a texture, and Julian was drowning in both. He looked directly into my face, the same eyes, the same bone structure, 6 years of history between us, and he saw nothing but a high-priced savior he was paying an obscene amount of money to fix his mistake. Not one flicker of recognition. People like Julian don't really see the people beneath them. They see roles. The quiet analyst in the sweater and the elite consultant in the bespoke suit were never going to register as the same human being, because Julian had never actually looked at me closely enough the first time to recognize me the second. "Mr. Reyes," I said, extending my hand first, which I'd practiced, small thing, but it sets a tone. The person who offers their hand first is, psychologically, the person in control of the room. Arthur Vale, Apex Solutions. I understand you're sitting on a structural failure nobody's been able to name. He actually laughed, a thin, nervous sound. "We're hoping you can name it for us." I almost told him I already had, 6 years ago when I named it Pellucid. "It's bad, Mr. Reyes," I told him, in a voice I'd practiced to be about 30% slower and 20% colder than my own. I haven't seen decay patterns like this outside of a deliberately engineered attack. His face went the color of old paper. I spent the next 2 weeks doing the single most enjoyable consulting engagement of my professional life. I diagnosed the system in front of him using just enough genuine technical jargon to make every word land like a verdict. Cascading margin drift, recursive miscalibration, structural rot in the core valuation layer, phrases that were, depending on how you squinted, either completely accurate or completely theatrical. I let Julian watch me work and understand absolutely none of it, which is its own kind of cruelty. The cruelty of a man finally face to face with exactly how little he actually knows about the thing he claimed to have built. There was an afternoon about a week into the engagement when Julian came into the conference room I'd commandeered and just stood there, watching me scroll through dashboards he couldn't read either. "Just give me the headline," he said. "Something I can take to the board tomorrow." I remember looking up at him slowly, another practiced beat, another small theater of control, and saying, "The headline, Mr. Reyes, is that whoever built this system originally built it to last. Whatever's failing now isn't a flaw in the architecture. It's a flaw in how it's been handled since." I watched that land. I watched him not understand that I just told him the entire truth to his face plainly, and that he'd nodded along to it like client-pleasing nonsense. Then I started feeding him rope. I'd offer him an insight, subtly wrong, urgent-sounding, always framed as the only way to keep the board from finding out how bad the real numbers were. And Julian, desperate and out of his depth, would take it straight to senior leadership as his own strategic judgment. Each adjustment he made to fix things actually tightened the trap. I watched him present my recommendations in 3 separate leadership meetings, as if he'd arrived at them himself. Watched him grow visibly more confident with everyone, mistaking my engineered lifeline for his own competence returning. He was so terrified of being exposed as the man who broke the company that he never once stopped to ask why the elite consultant kept handing him exactly the rope he needed to hang himself with. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for a Thursday morning. Global investors dialed in. The CEO sat at the head of a glass conference table long enough to land a plane on, and Julian stood at the podium in a suit now slightly too big for him. Stress does that. Shrinks a man from the inside before it ever touches the outside. Picture 2 realities happening in the same room at the exact same second. In the first reality, Julian was sweating through silk. The live risk dashboard behind him, the one he'd insisted on projecting in real time to demonstrate transparency, was turning a deeper red with every passing minute. He stammered through phrases like agile resilience framework and forward-looking risk posture, corporate seasoning with absolutely nothing underneath it. The conversational equivalent of serving microwaved, store-bought rotisserie chicken on the firm's finest china, and hoping nobody notices the plastic container still in the trash. Investors on the video call started muting themselves to murmur to whoever was sitting next to them off camera. I could see it even from across the table, the exact moment a room stops pretending to believe the person talking. In the second reality, I sat at the far end of that same table, in a suit that fit exactly the way it was supposed to, sipping an espresso I'd had sent up from the lobby cafe because I knew, almost to the minute, how this meeting was going to end. I had a tablet in front of me with a quiet countdown running. I wasn't nervous. You're never nervous about a collapse you personally designed the blueprint for. I remember noticing, almost academically, how calm my own pulse was while the man across the table was visibly coming apart at the seams. Proof, if I ever needed any, that the only difference between panic and patience is knowing what happens next. To save the company, to save himself really, though he'd never have phrased it that way, Julian needed one final move. I gave it to him. Weeks earlier, Apex had proposed an aggressive financial restructuring package, a complicated, high-risk maneuver that would, on paper, absorb the margin losses and quietly make the last quarter's damage disappear into an accounting structure dense enough that nobody on the board would ever bother to unpack it. I had engineered every clause. Julian presented it as his own strategy. Of course he did. He'd spent his entire career wearing other people's architecture as his own coat, and he wasn't about to stop in front of the one audience that mattered most. I take full personal responsibility for this restructuring, he told the board, signing his name across the bottom of the final page with the kind of flourish men use when they think they're being saved. I designed this framework specifically to protect the firm. The ink had barely dried before I touched a single key on my tablet. It unlocked the full data history, every altered access log from 6 years prior, every falsified compliance report, every line of the original Pellucid build with my name embedded in the metadata, every adjustment I'd recommended over the past 2 weeks, time-stamped and cross-referenced against the very paperwork Julian had just signed under his own name and his own full personal responsibility. The restructuring deal didn't save the firm. It didn't need to. The firm itself was never actually in danger. The decay was cosmetic compared to what was coming. What that signature actually did was legally and irreversibly certify, in Julian's own handwriting, that he had knowingly executed a multi-million-dollar financial cover-up to conceal a crisis he had lied about creating, using a strategy provided to him by an outside consultant he could not even correctly identify. Compliance security walked Julian out less than 40 minutes later, not from his office, from the building. Federal fraud charges don't wait for a man to clear his calendar. I watched two officers in plain clothes walk him past the same lobby where Desmond used to wave me through every morning, and I noticed, with a kind of quiet satisfaction I'm not going to pretend I didn't feel, that nobody on that floor offered Julian so much as a sympathetic glance on his way out. The same building that had applauded his promotion 6 months earlier didn't blink watching him go. Before they took him through the doors, I leaned in close enough that only he could hear me. "You treated my architecture like a work order, Julian. You treated my presence like a line of code you could just delete." I let that sit for a second, the way you let a final query finish running before you read the result. You forgot the most basic rule of data integrity. A pipeline only holds together when the person who built it is standing next to it. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The look on his face did all the work I would have wanted my voice to do anyway. For 1 second, one full, unbroken second, I watched him actually see me. Not Arthur Vale from Apex Solutions. Arthur Vance. The quiet guy in the gray sweater he'd erased without a second thought. I'll admit that second was worth more to me than the consulting fee. The board, to their credit, moved fast once the full picture was in front of them. They offered me Julian's vacated senior vice president seat on the spot, double his old salary, full equity package, a corner office 2 floors up from where I used to sit in a gray sweater nobody noticed. I said no. Not out of pride, out of architecture. I never wanted his chair. I wanted my name back on the work I'd actually built, and I wanted to watch, just once in my life, what happens when the load-bearing piece walks away and nobody can pretend not to notice anymore. A title was never going to give me that. It would have just made me the next person sitting comfortably on top of someone else's foundation, and I'd spent 6 years learning exactly how that story ends for the person underneath. I closed my laptop, slid it into the same leather case I'd carried in on day 1 of the engagement, and shook the CEO's hand on my way out. My record was clean again. My reputation, fully restored, plus a consulting fee that made my old 6 years of salary look like a rounding error of its own. I walked out of Halbrook Meridian into an ordinary afternoon, traffic, sunlight, somebody's car alarm going off 2 blocks down, and for the first time in almost a year, the system in my head was finally quiet, balanced, running exactly the way it was supposed to. Some people think revenge has to be loud to count. I've never believed that. The loudest thing in that entire boardroom was a silence, the sound of nobody being able to say a single word in Julian's defense, because every word that mattered was already sitting right there in his own signature. You don't have to scream to bring a structure down. Sometimes all you have to do is build it correctly, walk away quietly, and let everyone else find out on their own schedule exactly what they were standing on. If this story hit something real for you, if you've ever watched someone wear your work like it was theirs, and stayed quiet because you were already 3 moves ahead, let me know in the comments. Tell me your city, and tell me what you do for a living, because I want to know how many architects are watching this video right now and just smiling to themselves. If you want more stories like this one, quiet people, loud consequences, hit subscribe, because there's another one coming, and trust me, it's worse for the guy at the podium. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.